Jen Kuria had moved to the US back in 2001 after the death of her husband. She was seeking asylum for her two daughters, as she was afraid that because she had opposed the FGM, which FGM, if you are in Kenya, it was quite popular back then, quite out in the open. But these days it's barely heard of, but I'm pretty sure it still exists, but I'm hoping the practice gets stamped out, because it really doesn't help any woman out there. It's horrific, traumatic. I don't think it should exist, but back then it was quite rampant, and she was afraid because she had opposed FGM, it could possibly endanger the lives of her two girls. So she had applied for asylum in the US for the girls, but the first time she applied it was denied, and she was in the process of appealing that decision at the time of her passing. So that is why Jane moved to the US, because of she was afraid of for the lives of her daughters. So the first place she moved to was Boston back in 2001. Then in 2002 she moved to Georgia, settling down in Powder Springs. In Powder Springs she found quite a safe neighborhood, a good place to raise a family, so she settled there. She worked as a nurse at a local hospital and also as a caregiver. Jen Kuria was described by her family as being very hardworking. She was a very hardworking woman. She worked so hard to put the children through school, pay their house bills. She put out her all to ensure that the kids had a comfortable life in a new country, and I'm sure a lot of the people in the diaspora can relate to this feeling. You're in another country, you're trying to adjust, and Jane was a single mother with 3 children. It was quite hard for her, but she really worked hard. She was a very, very diligent person, really. She was described as being very kind, friendly, social butterfly. She was just an easy-going person. She would easily make friends with the people around her. She even became friends with the people she looked after, as a caregiver. So she really loved being around people, and people really liked her as well because she was quite a lovely, friendly person. To her children, she was described as being quite firm and gentle at the same time. She would be strict when it was about the children's education, but a little relaxed when it was time to have a good time. So she was quite a balanced parent, not too firm, not too strict, not too gentle, just quite balanced, really. And she was also described as being very family oriented. She was actually the one who used to organize family gatherings and reunions. They all used to gather at her home. She was quite a nice person, and people in her circle really liked her. And her children, the children were described as being quite polite and well behaved. Even when out in the neighborhood, the neighbors would say they were quite polite. They were also very kind. One neighbor would describe how Annabelle would always walk her young brother to the bus stop every day, and that stood out to that neighbor, because who does that every day? Like, you walk your brother to the bus stop every other day, but Annabelle would do that. So that love and care and kindness among the children really stood out to the neighbors, and they thought they were quite a good family, really. 2007, Isabel was around 19 years old. She was starting college. She was the eldest of the 3. Annabelle, who was the middle child, was around 16 years old, and she was starting high school. And during her free time, she would babysit for another Kenyan family. She would babysit the kids during her free time. And she was also quite involved in church activities, in their area. Jeremy was also in school. It's unclear which grade he was in at this time, but he was also in school as well. All of them were busy into their education, really. And all of the family members really were quite balanced, kind, wonderful family, trying to adjust and settle down in a new country, really. So let's get to the date of 1st August 2007. Pauline, who was Jane's sister-in-law, knocked on Diana's door at 9:45 a.m. and asked Diana to take her to Jane's house. She had been calling Jane, but Jane wasn't picking up her phone, and she thought it odd, really, because that was really out of character for Jane to do. And the whole family had gone silent, so she was very concerned for their well-being. And another thing, Pauline's son Peter was staying at Jane's house, having arrived from Kenya 2 days earlier, so she was concerned because Jane was looking after her son, but she wasn't answering her phone. No other family member was answering the phone, so as a mother she was quite concerned for her son as well as the Kurias, really. So she went with Diana to check on Jane. She was quite concerned, and they went together. They hopped into Diana's car and drove to Jane's house. When they got there, Pauline rushed to knock at the front door while Diana went to the back door. Now, when Diana was approaching the back door, she noticed that the back sliding door was unlocked. It was not, all the way locked. It was unlocked. Definitely spoke to her even more. The whole house was quiet. There was something eerie about the whole place, and Diana felt that, when you're approaching a house, you definitely are usually able to gauge whether there's people inside or not. And in this case, there wasn't any. She didn't feel like there was anybody in the house, and the door being unlocked and the family being away was quite odd to her. So definitely she was spooked about the whole situation. She got to the door and peeked inside. The whole house was quiet and dark. The blinds were down, and the only source of light in the home was a TV which was on. On it was playing some cartoons. That was the only source of light. The whole house was dark, really dark and quiet. So definitely piqued Diana's interest. She felt that she needed to go inside to investigate what really happened or what's going on. So after picking for a minute, not being able to, see things clearly, she got in and she walked into the house. And as soon as she's in there, she notices the blood. Blood was everywhere. And when I say everywhere, I mean everywhere. She then noticed a body on the floor. And at that point, everything starts connecting in her head. And she realizes that she has just walked into a crime scene. The blood and the body, something had definitely happened in there. And at that, she starts heading back to the door, and she's spooked by the whole thing, really. She knows that she needs to get out of there right away. When she's almost out, she bumps into Pauline, who had rushed to the back door to get into the home as well. When Diana runs into Pauline at the door, she tells Pauline that they need to leave the house immediately. Now, Pauline is confused at this because why is she saying this? They're here to investigate what happened to Jane. Why is she telling her that they need to get out of the house? So she asks Diana, what's going on? Why do you want us to leave? And then Diana tells her that she's seen a body and they need to leave the house. At this, Pauline becomes hysterical. She breaks down and asks Diana, are they all dead? Are they all dead? But Diana didn't have an answer for that. So they leave the house quickly. And as soon as they got out of the house, Diana calls the police right away. Pauline then, beside Diana's watch, she starts informing other family members what they've discovered. The police rush there and they're met with a horrific scene. Every family member was in a different place in the home. All of them had severe head injuries. They had been bludgeoned, by an object. 3 of the Kurias, Jane and her daughters, unfortunately had already passed away from their injuries. They were declared dead at the scene. For Jeremy and Peter, they were still alive. By chance, by possibly a miracle, they were still hanging on. They were rushed to the hospital. Jeremy, because his condition was really bad, he had to be airlifted to the hospital, and Peter was rushed there in an ambulance. And there they remained in critical condition, barely hanging on. But they would both survive that ordeal. Diana and Pauline would be taken away from the house to be questioned, also to be informed of what happened to the couriers and what the police had found in there. The rest of the family members, after receiving news of the couriers, they were shocked and they were quite alarmed of the whole situation. They were afraid that the person who did this to the couriers might still want to come back, after hearing that Peter and Jeremy had survived. They theorized maybe he could come back and do this, or finish off the boys, or even the rest of the family members. They requested the police that they be stationed at the hospital where the boys were. So outside their rooms, there was a police officer there guarding them, protecting them in case of anything, so that the family would feel a little bit much safer. Diana was quite shaken by the whole situation, by the whole incident. It was quite traumatic for her. She would not go into her own home. She was quite disturbed by what she saw at Jane's home, but that she was quite afraid of her own home as well. So if it was a time where she was to be alone at her own home without company, she would rather sleep or stay in her car other than be alone in her home, because she thought maybe people were targeting them. So she was quite afraid of the whole situation, and she would be comforted by seeing her neighbors around. Even when the neighbors were in their own homes, she was quite comforted by the idea that someone was close by. It was such a traumatic experience, and it still haunts her to this day. She still remembers everything as clear as it happened, but she's much better today. She just still wants to know what really happened to the couriers that night, and who was responsible for it. Police got into investigating the murders. Now, because of how severely the couriers were attacked, the police theorized that it had to be someone close to the family, or someone known by the family, someone with very extreme emotions. They were bludgeoned with an object, and the blows were over the top. It was an overkill. The attacker kept on swinging and inflicting injuries even after clearly the victim had already passed away. The attacker kept on causing even further damage to the body. So it's thought that this person had extreme emotions against the family, maybe that of hatred, rage, revenge, or jealousy, because the attacker wanted to ensure that none of them would survive. He wanted to ensure that they died. Now, if it's another case scenario where it doesn't involve the family members, I'm not so sure whether that person would go into that much damage, but this person clearly had something against this family. That's what the police thought. So because it came out that it could be a person close to the family, Diana was asked about, she was asked who she thought could have done this to the couriers, and she couldn't think of anyone. She didn't know, because to her, Jane had no enemies. Jane was a very good person, kind, family oriented. Jane had, according to Diana, she had no enemies, so she couldn't think of anyone who would want to do this to Jane. So let's get to the timeline. Isabella answered an email after midnight on July 31st. Then at 3 a.m. a phone call was placed to the house, but Jane didn't answer. So this placed the time of the murder between midnight and 3 a.m. that night. And at that time, the neighbors were asleep and they didn't hear anything. That was the time of the murders, between midnight and 3 a.m. That was what happened at that time. Now, at the house, there were no signs of forced entry, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't forced entry because there are no signs. But from what the police were able to gather, there were no signs of forced entry, and the police thought that the person might have been let in by Jane or either one of the family members. They theorized that Jane might have known the person. The table in the home indicated that someone was there with Jane. Jane and this person were sat and they were having a conversation or having a discussion while sitting around the table. Now this happened right before the attack, according to what they're seeing at the scene, that the table indicated that there were people there having a talk or something. So Jane might have seen the attacker. And why they theorized that Jane might have seen the attacker, because she, of all the family members, had defensive wounds. She fought her attacker, meaning she might have seen this person. Now, the weapon used was not found at the scene. It was theorized that the attacker came to the house with the weapon. The weapon wasn't found in the home when the police got there, and none of the things in Jane's house was used as a weapon. So they theorized that probably the person who came to the house, or the attacker, came with the weapon and left with it as well. So what stood out for the detectives really at the scene, there was no blood transfer from one scene to the next. Like from one body to the next, there was no blood transfer. The scenes were very separate, which is a bit confusing because it's as if the attack was carried out by, more than one person using a different weapon on each person. Because if you're using one weapon, there has to be transfer of blood from one victim to the next. But in this case, there was no blood transfer. There wasn't any. There was also no blood of the attacker that was found on the scene. It is thought that even if he bled out, his blood got so mixed with that of Jane that they couldn't really detect or identify it, because it had kind of mixed with that of Jane, so it was hard to really identify. So there was no blood of the attacker at the scene. Also, there were no prints found. Only those of the family were found around the house, and there were no prints of the attacker. And it is thought that maybe he wore gloves to protect his finger, his prints, because how could he be in that house and leave no prints at all? So maybe he wore gloves. It's a possibility that he wore gloves to protect his prints from being identified. There was little evidence to go on, and definitely this slowed down the case, because remember, there's no blood transfer, there are no prints found at the scene, no murder weapon, none of the family members saw the attacker. So, and the ones who saw, like Jane, who saw the attacker, had passed away. So it was quite, there was little evidence, and definitely slowed down the case. Still investigating, the police questioned the family and friends of Jane to see if any would lead them or point them in any direction. So what's going on about this, the police attended a family gathering to see if any of them were acting suspicious. While at this gathering, the detectives were approached by one of the family friends who told them to look at the Mungiki from Kenya, as they could be involved in the case. Remember earlier I mentioned that Jane was against the FGM, so this guy was trying to claim that the Mungiki were involved in the murders as some sort of revenge on Jane. The detective felt that this guy was trying to mislead them into the wrong direction with this information. The detectives still investigated this lead, and they couldn't find any evidence connecting the Mungiki to the murders. So this is where the Mungiki claim comes in. Now, because of this false lead, the guy managed, the same guy managed to bring a spotlight onto himself. The police got suspicious of him, and because of the claims of the Mungiki all the way from Kenya, they started looking at him as a potential suspect. They questioned him several times, and they established that the man was from Kenya and he had been in the US for some time, and he was married and had kids. The same kids that Annabelle actually babysat. So it was this guy, this family friend. So he was quite known by the Kurias. He worked during the day until early afternoon, and his wife worked during the night. When he was asked what he was doing the night of the attack, he just said that he was home. Problem is, there was no one at home. Remember, his wife works at night, so he leaves work early afternoon, and during the night of the attack, he said that he was home. Problem is, with his alibi, no one could confirm it. There was no one else. The children were young, so they couldn't really confirm his alibi. But this is the story he gave to the police. The detective questioned him further and also collected his DNA, but he couldn't be linked to the scene. The police looked at Jane's phone history, to see if they could unearth anything from on there, or if Jane was calling anyone, or anyone who was unknown who called Jane's number. So they looked at her phone history. They went over her phone history from over a month ago, to establish the frequent callers and who's the last person to talk to her. Their detectives discovered that between Jane and the man who made the Mungiki claims, there had been very many calls between them, like over 300 calls between the two over that month alone. And days before, there were 10 calls between Jane and this man. Strangely enough, on July 31st and 1st August, there were no calls made from this man. Days before, 10 calls. But on that day, when everybody's looking, asking or trying to find where Jane is, there's no call from this man. Not even a single call. When he was asked about this, he got, the whole situation. He said he didn't know why he never called on that day. He didn't know. He didn't have a reason as to why he never called on that day. When questioned about whether he had a relationship with Jane, he said that they were just friends, nothing more. They were just friends. That's the story he gave them. But Diana, when questioned about their relationship between Jane and this man, she said that she thought there was something going on between them. Diana recalled an event. She had seen the pair one time at a liquor store, and they were going to a dinner party, so they were in their store. They were behaving as something more than friends. So she thought that there had to be something going on between this man and Jane. But remember, this is much later. This is just years later that Jane is actually recalling this information after hearing about the calls between this man and Jane. She recalled this event and she thought, yeah, probably there was something going on between them. But the man maintained they were just friends. When he was asked about the other phone calls between, him and Jane, he said that he used to be a helper, sort of a handyman around Jane's house. Like he would come and mow her lawn or fix stuff around her house. So that's the reason he gave for the calls. But I don't know what kind of renovation Jane's house would need, that they would need to communicate over 300 times. And this man was a married man. Remember, he's a married man. And even if it's a handy man, really, over 300 calls over the course of a month, really, that's a lot of calls, isn't it? But he said he was just a handyman, and that's what their conversation was all about, fixing stuff around the house. Now, the rest of the family member, after they caught wind that this man was being looked into by the police, they started looking at the whole situation with this man and how he had behaved with the family before. A rumor starts going on around the family that he could have been the one to attack the family because of the inappropriate relationship he had with Annabelle. Remember, Annabelle babysat this man's kids. Now, Annabelle used to babysit, his kids a lot. Apparently, to reward Annabelle for this gesture, he would take Annabelle out on dinner dates. The problem here is only two of them would go, this man and Annabelle. It's a bit strange, because why is this man, who's just a family friend, taking out Annabelle on a dinner date for a reward as a baby? I mean, he could have paid her. Why a dinner date? And I'm not saying it's bad to go out on dinner dates, but it's quite a bit strange, isn't it? That only two of them would go, not even any other family member, only two of them. It's a little strange. So the family were thinking about this. Jane allowed this. Probably she thought nothing of it then, because this guy was married, he had kids, and had a good standing with the family, so she probably thought nothing of it. And the family also thought nothing of it back then. It's only later, after they hear about him being investigated, that they think probably there was something there. Maybe he had tried to approach Annabelle in an inappropriate way, because remember, Annabelle is only 16 years old and this guy is older, has kids, and he's married. So he thought that he could be the one to attack the family, because Jane had found out that he had approached Annabelle in an inappropriate way, and at the same time he was also trying to establish a relationship with her as well. So Jane, they theorize that Jane became furious about it and confronted this man, but he didn't like it and he attacked the family. But this was just a theory or a rumor that was going on around there. It was looked into. It wasn't really confirmed that that was the case. Another area that was looked into was Jane's financial situation. They found out, that the same guy had borrowed the money from Jane about a year prior. He had borrowed a large sum of money from Jane to send to his father back in Kenya for him to buy wheat. Now, it was a large sum of money. It's unclear here whether he paid back the money to Jane. What was the situation? What was the agreement with Jane? It's unclear, but it was looked into whether it could be a motive, but they weren't able to establish whether that could be his motive for doing this, really. But there was that. It came up when they were looking at Jane's financial situation. When Diana was questioned about Jane's finances, she recalled a time she overheard Jane talking to her mother who was back in Kenya. Jane had told her mother that she would be sending her some money, and the mother got curious of the amount, and Jane told her that she would be sending around $30,000 to her. Now Jane's mom got concerned, because Jane was a single mother in a foreign country trying to raise 3 kids. Definitely concerned, she was definitely concerned about where she was getting the money from. Jane told her mother that she was getting into some business and that she would be sending the money and shouldn't worry. She didn't elaborate further on the business she was getting into, and they left it at that. They never really talked about it anymore. They left it at that. Now Diana recalled this just years later when she's being asked about her finances, and this came about. They didn't know, and possibly Diana thought that it could mean something to the investigators, if she told them about this, and she did. Business she was going into was actually looked into. So about Jane's business that she was getting into, she never told any of her family members. She never elaborated on it. It was only later, that the detectives would discover that what it was all about. She had gotten into a real estate business with some of her friends, and at the time of her passing, they were in the process of selling a house, so that was where she was getting the money from. And so that was the money she wanted to send to her mother. So possible links to the murder in terms of her finances. It could be the guy who borrowed money from her, or it could be the people she was getting into business with, or it could be the people even who she wanted to sell the house to. But all of them were looked into, but none of them could be confirmed. So that was another angle that they looked into when it came to investigating this case. Now it came to the final time where they had to question the boys. Remember, the boys had been rushed to the hospital. They were recovering. They recovered for a bit and they were going on well at that time. Now this is what the detectives found out. Jeremy couldn't remember what had taken place that night. They theorized that possibly they were attacked when they were sleeping and he didn't see the attacker, or even if he saw the attacker, because of the severe head injuries, he had lost that memory. He couldn't remember, so he didn't remember anything of the attack, and still to this day he really doesn't remember. Peter remembered a little, and he recalled seeing a Kenyan man in a floral shirt entering the home, but couldn't remember the face. He couldn't really clearly remember the face. In the reports, they say that the man was speaking a Kenyan language. It's unclear whether they refer to Swahili or Kikuyu, but he was speaking a Kenyan dialect. Years later, still, even years later, still, Peter really doesn't remember that much even about the man's face, but he remembers the man was wearing a floral shirt. And other than that, he still doesn't remember. Even Jeremy, all of them, both of the boys, really don't remember much about that night. So the police didn't get much from that. Another route which presented itself in terms of this case was when the police found a discarded towel soaked in blood about 2 miles from the home in a ditch. They found this towel, and the odd thing here is they found this towel after they had searched that place. So the day before they had searched the place, the towel wasn't there, but the next day it was there, almost as if it was placed there by someone. And this was quite odd, and it was collected as evidence, and the blood didn't match any of the family members, and they thought that possibly the blood could belong to the attacker. And it brought another angle to this, and the police theorized that possibly there could have been 2 people involved in the murders, and that would explain as to why the scenes were quite separate, and possibly the blood belonged to one of the attackers. But it was tested, the blood was tested in the samples collected. It was tested, but they couldn't really establish whether it was they couldn't really link it to the case. So it presented itself, but no one was ever identified from the blood. That is all about what has been investigated so far, and it's still years later and no one has ever been arrested for this murder. No suspect has been even identified. It's still an unsolved case, and it's gone a little cold, but hopefully that by getting this information out there, it could refresh someone's memory and it will be solved. I'm hoping it will be solved, because we really want to know what really happened to this family. Who would do this to the Kurias? And if you have any information, if you're part of the Kenyan diaspora and you live there, you saw something, you know something, you could reach to the police by even calling 911, or you could write to them through this email, callcase@Cobb County. So you can do that if you do have any information. So please reach out to the police if you do. Thank you all for listening, and I'm hoping that one day we'll get to know, and that the Kurias will eventually get justice for this, for what really happened to them. Thank you all for listening, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.